We have Mr. Venkatesh Hariharan with us. He is the India representative of the Open Invention Network. Venki has over 34 years of experience in journalism and public policy, working with organizations like Indian Express, Red Hat, Google, and FOSS United. He's been a driving force in promoting open source in India, co-founding indlinux.org and making Linux available in 17 Indian languages. Today, he'll be discussing the economic impact of free and open source software and how it can shape policy in India. Please join me in welcoming Venki for his talk.
Hi, my name is Venkatesh Hariharan. I've been involved with the FOSS community since 99, 2000 in various capacities as the head of public policy at Red Hat. Since then, worked as the head of policy at Google and a number of other organizations, until recently as the head of policy at FOSS United. So very quickly, I'll just walk you through the reasons why we should measure the value of FOSS for India. What are some of the similar studies that have been done and why should we care about it? In a nutshell, when we contribute to open source, we get messages saying that, hey, thanks for adding this feature or thanks for developing this piece of software. But at a national level, what does it add up to? How does it benefit the country as a whole? To do that, we need to do systematic studies, and in India, we have done a couple of these studies in the past. The Harvard University and the University of Toronto did a study recently which found that the derived value of FOSS is as high as $8.8 trillion. So I think I'll just give you a quick summary of all of that. And I think it was Lord Kelvin who said that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So today we have a situation where there is massive amounts of open source being used, but there is not a great sense of how people are using it, where, etc., etc. This is one of the big challenges of FOSS, that because you are not selling licenses, you don't know how much of usage is happening. An organization may download one copy of, let's say, Linux or some FOSS software, but make 1,000 copies of it internally. So there is the metrics in terms of numbers, etc., is very hard to come by. The other challenge is that there is the tragedy of the commons, and Sachin alluded to that in the previous with that little slide from XKCD. The tragedy of the commons is that anything that is a commons good, like air and water, it's everybody's problem and nobody's problem. We realize the value of something that is in the commons only when we are deprived of it. So when we can't breathe fresh air, we realize the value of it. When we have to buy water in tankers and pay 2,000 rupees per tanker, that's when we realize the value of it. So in order to prevent the tragedy of the commons, we have to measure the value of the commons. It's also helpful to understand where are we currently. To what extent are organizations using FOSS? Anecdotally, I think we will all agree that almost 90 to 95% of software usage in organizations today is mostly FOSS. The level of proprietary software usage is very low, and this is a dramatic change. When I started working at Red Hat in 2004. Proprietary software was the de facto standard and open source was the exception. And today the situation is completely the opposite. Today proprietary software is a thin layer on top of open source software. So when you look at, say, SaaS, etc., etc., most of these products are built on top of open source. I mentioned that, how does our individual contributions add up? And how do we craft policy pathways that support the FOSS community? So what are we doing about it? Thanks to Kailash and the Samagata Foundation, they agreed to sponsor this study, and the National Law School agreed to do this research. We have Shobham Shinde from the National Law School here, and Professor Arul Skaria, who's a professor of innovation, and Professor Surya Prakash Mishra, who teaches economics. They are the principal investigators. So we hope to complete this study very quickly and have the findings available. Who else has done similar studies? In 2009, when I was part of Red Hat, we commissioned IIM Bangalore to do a study on the impact of FOSS. And that study found that if Indian organizations, Indian government, etc., aggressively moved to FOSS, we could save at least $1 billion a year. And that was, of course, 2009. So much has changed. I think the adoption of FOSS since 2009 has shot up tremendously. So I'm actually very curious to see what is the latest finding, what is the latest number that we come up with, and I'm sure it will be way more than $1 billion per annum. In 2015, with support from ICFOSS, IIMB did a refresh of that study. In this time, they did not try to put a number to it, but they found that, well, I'll come back to that. The European Union also did a study, and I'll share the findings of those. The 2015 study found that FOSS has long-term intangible and strategic benefits. And for example, they found that in Kerala, when teachers were using FOSS, because of the do-it-yourself nature of FOSS, the ability of the teachers to understand how the system works, to troubleshoot it themselves, etc., was much higher than when using proprietary software. The Harvard study found that if you just replace proprietary software with open source software and equivalent software, the value for the economy is about 4.15 billion. But if every end user replace the software at their end, that would be close to 8.8 trillion. Personally, I feel that the numbers are kind of an underestimate and an overestimate on both ends. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between. The European Union found that 10% increase in FOSS contribution from the European Union would generate between 0.4 to 0.6 additional GDP every year. They also found that if we increase FOSS contributions from the European Union by 10%, there will be at least 600 to 800 additional startups that will be formed because of that. Yeah. Worth about $10 billion. Yeah. Good that you mentioned that. So David Wheeler is somebody who has been studying the economic value of the Linux operating system at the Linux Foundation, and he said that if the 236 million lines of code that constitute the Linux operating system were to be built commercially, the cost would be about $10 billion to build that. So they have some, models for that, the COCOMO model, etc., to estimate the value of the code. So yeah, I agree with you. If you look at middleware, if you look at virtualization technologies, etc., etc. Yeah. Yeah, even if you look at, so there are other ways to estimate the value. Today if you look at every startup in India, whether it is Flipkart or the younger startups, I have looked at the tech architecture of many of these startups, and I mean almost 90-95% is pretty FOSS, MySQL, etc., etc. So why do we need this? Why do we need to do this? And since we are a cricket-loving nation, I think every time we go to policymakers, we are arguing on the back foot. Because what has happened over the years is that the proprietary vendors have created so much of fear, uncertainty, and doubt about open source software that you are always fighting a battle on the back foot. You have to kind of say, oh no, open source is secure. It's so the classic doubts that have been spread are because the code is open, it must be less secure, etc., etc. And I'm quite surprised sometimes that, when I was at Red Hat in 2004, we used to get these kind of questions. And we are in 2014, and we're still getting those kind of questions. So it's like 24. 2 decades later, we're still getting those kind of questions. So I think there is just so much of work that needs to be done to educate policymakers uh, in the value of FOSS. And if we kind of keep drilling home to the policymakers that FOSS creates enormous benefits to India, I think the game completely changes, our narrative completely changes. When we go to the policymakers and say that basically when it comes to say issues like software patenting, this is completely diametrically opposite to the 4 freedoms of FOSS, because somebody who's got the patent, he can say, hey, you are using my method and therefore pay me a royalty. So even basic things like slide to unlock, voting, online voting systems, there's so many basic things that have been patented, and unfortunately the amount of patenting has gone up in India. Now, on one hand, we are talking of Atmanirbhar Bharat. On the other hand, Chinese companies are getting patents on online messaging systems. So the right hand of the government does not know what the left arm of the government is doing. And if we kind of drill home that FOSS is important for India's strategic autonomy, FOSS is creating tremendous amount of jobs. FOSS is creating tremendous amount of value for startups. Then I think we are changing the narrative, but we still haven't changed the narrative. I think there is a lot of work to be done. I want to speak a little bit about this strategic autonomy bit. I think all of us are seeing that the world is kind of getting divided into camps. You have a Chinese camp, you have an American camp. But what is interesting about the geopolitics is that FOSS is something that does not belong to any camp. It belongs to the global commons. So whether it's a Chinese company or an Indian company or an American company or a Nigerian company, all of us benefit from the usage of FOSS. The advantage with FOSS is that we get the latest technologies, we can download the latest operating system, we can download the latest middleware, databases, etc., etc. So we can preserve our independence while getting the latest technologies for free. So it's as we kind of as the globe fragments into these geopolitical camps, FOSS is really important for Indian companies and for the Indian government to preserve strategic autonomy. And this kind of reminds me. Many years ago, I had met with the team that was building GST, and so GST was not yet live. And so when I went to the office of the GST CEO, all the big proprietary companies were sitting outside the door waiting for a meeting with the CEO. I went and met with him on behalf of Red Hat at that time and asked him, why have you decided to go with open source? So they said, see, we clearly know that, these vendors will come and they will offer 80% discount for the first 3 years. After that 3-year term is over, the cost goes up. And, we completely logged in. This is a project of national importance. Our budget is $300 million. So if we want $400 million to, increase the budget to buy more software, we can do that. It's not a money issue. But we want complete freedom to be able to swap out one component and then, replace it with another component. So recently they kind of also, I think about a year ago, they pulled out some components, bought in another components because they wanted to increase the throughput, because now you have so many people who are, using GST. The number of invoices flowing through the GST system has gone up tremendously. So I think this kind of strategic autonomy, this kind of digital sovereignty is a really important issue, and FOSS plays into that. And this is not something that can be quantified in financial terms. The other thing is that the government is, can be a force multiplier. If you look at, say, IndiaFOSS, where the government hosts its own software, last I checked, there were 2,600 projects that were put up on the IndiaFOSS website. Unfortunately, none of them have a community. But if we can get the government to start building a community around OpenForge. Who knows? Maybe hundreds of startups can come up around that. The software that is built by the Indian government can be taken to Africa, Middle East, and so many other countries. So the services economy around open source can grow exponentially, and programmers like you, developers like you can have more options of jobs. The last point is that India has some of the most fantastic open source policies. We have a policy which clearly says that the government will not use proprietary software, proprietary encodings for data storage, etc. So JPEG, for example, is a proprietary format, and they've said use PNG. So we have some of the best policies. Another policy says that all things being used equal, the government will use open source over proprietary software. Then they have the OpenForge policy, which is basically saying that all government applications should be hosted on OpenForge as much as possible, so that it can be freely reused across government departments. So as a FOSS evangelist, we can't ask for better FOSS-friendly policies, but in India the problem always is that policies are fantastic. We are great at English, we are great at writing policies, but in terms of implementation, we really need to do a much, much better job. So if we kind of highlight the value of FOSS for the Indian economy, we can then start batting on the front foot and really push for greater FOSS adoption in government, more FOSS-friendly policies, and maybe in another 10 years, I think we could be the global leader in FOSS adoption and deployment across the globe. So yeah, that's the quick summary. If there are any questions, I can just take one or two questions.
This is general, a little bit of a broader question, but exactly points at what you're talking about.
Can you hold it closer?
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a broader question, but points at exactly what you're talking about. We have a really huge programmer ecosystem in India. We actually export them to a lot of countries, and we do amazing work. But most of the technologies that we are building on top of the open source that's been built, any frameworks all the way from low level to the higher level to latest React frameworks that we are working on, are not built here. Some variable is missing, that even though we have the smartest technical people here, we are not involved in the building that frameworks which others can build up of. What do you think is missing there? Because I see some countries where these are coming out of, where we are, yeah, you get the idea. Yeah.
So I think this is where we have to take a lesson from China. There is a fantastic book called The 100-Year Marathon, which talks about how the Chinese government has got a very detailed plan of how they will overtake other countries in different technologies. So if you look at electric vehicles, for example, the the government realized that we cannot overtake Volkswagen and other companies and other countries in the internal combustion engine. So they heavily invested in battery technologies. Similarly, they have identified artificial intelligence as one of the key technologies, and so they have been investing for the last 20 years in bringing back Chinese developers back to China, giving them huge amount of incentives, office space, budgets, venture capital money. So over the last 20 years, the kind of investment, you are now seeing the results of that. The Chinese, they are building large language models on their own. They are not dependent on the US for that. Some of that they have open sourced. So basically one of the great functions of the government is to enable the creation of technologies that individual private sector companies cannot. So this is where I think there is again many of these technologies that, for example, the quantum computing mission that India has, we are putting in about 8,000 crores into that. Apparently that is just 1/100th of what the Chinese government is investing in quantum technologies. So point is that unless we have investors who are willing to invest in deep tech, and the government which is willing to invest more heavily in deep tech, it's a long journey. Even with all these investments, this 8,000 crore in quantum, etc., the results will take at least another 10 years to come out.
This, but if you look at the most popular FOSS that we are building on top of, these are not coming out of the approach that you're talking about right now. The government is investing, US or European government investing in the developers,
Yeah.
or private sector investing in developers. It's developers creating hacker groups and finding problems that they are solving each other, and one of them kicks out, and other developers, it spreads around. That's how FOSS builds up. This approach, if this is not the approach that has created all this, how do you believe that this is, if we invest more money into this, just like China is doing right now, that's gonna give us what, give us the position we already have where other people have done it?
So you're talking of, so I spoke about a very top-down approach. You're arguing, or you're talking about the bottoms-up approach, right? So, for example, we saw the presentation in the morning by Ente. Tomorrow we'll see the presentation by Bruno. I think it is good that these kind of entrepreneurs are coming up who are building software from the bottom, and we need to encourage that. And that could mean that uh, in the form of grants, or in the form of, say, a more aggressive venture capital investing space, etc., etc. Although, personally, I really love the fact that Ente is bootstrapped, because I'm a big fan of bootstrap startups, and I think you should go to venture capitalists only when you really need it. If possible, avoid venture capital, because, you're in greater control of your destiny. But I think it's also a cultural tipping point in our society, because so much of software development that we were doing was for, on the basis of specifications that were given to us by others. So, the job security, and now, Vishnu's presentation about Ente was, we are breaking out of that mindset that, we need job security. We are saying that entrepreneurship can be a career in itself. So I'm hopeful, but I would say we need better venture capitalists. The current generation of investment bankers don't really understand how deep tech works. They are not willing to, invest in a company for the next 6-7 years, and they keep asking, where's the money, where's the money, where's the money, and many deep tech companies cannot be built like that. I know of at least 2 deep tech companies that I follow very closely, and I keep talking to the founders, and they keep saying that if I was a deep tech company and building this in Silicon Valley, I would have got $100 million by now. And here I'm asking for $5 million and I'm struggling with it. So, your question is easy to, there's a lot of layers to unpack with that question. One question, and then I'll come.
Hello. Hello, sir. It was a nice presentation, and you almost cover our Indian ecosystem on FOSS. So my question was that apart from Indian ecosystem on FOSS, it also implies that if we are going open source, there will be cyber threats, vulnerability, and everything will be more and more increasingly, because they can able to see the codes and everything. So my question was around that. In US and Canada, more companies are implementing different types of documentation, or like report standards and policies. So how Indian government is focusing on this kind of things, because if we are trying to promote FOSS, we have to also see the background of it, because if some data loss or anything happens, then it will be overall a fall for an Indian consumer or an Indian ecosystem. So can you answer that?
So, so basically, I think this myth that has been successfully propagated by the proprietary companies is that because the code is open source is less secure. But I think bottom line is that if you look at, say, Bombay Stock Exchange, if you look at some of the largest e-government projects in India, they are all using open source. So I think we need to do. I would say that we need more people in Delhi who can work with the government and counteract all this fear, uncertainty, doubt, and gradually things are changing. I think what we are finding is that many of the policymakers in Delhi are also extremely smart and very savvy, and are able to cut through the bullshit and say that And I think some of these arguments like strategic autonomy, etc., are also going to be important. But see, here's the thing. The report that we are writing, it's like a police investigation, a fact-finding mission. eventually then that has to go to the code. That part of it cannot be done by the report. People, we need our people in Delhi who can, walk you know, walk up and down Ministry of IT and Ministry of Telecom and tell them that, hey, look at this report. You need to start adopting more of FOSS because this is good for India. So we can talk a little bit more about it after this. Yeah. But it's unpacking your question is not a very easy, it's not a one-liner answer that I can give.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah, yeah. Vinky, at the start you mentioned about measuring the impact and you said that what can't be measured can't be managed, right? Yeah. So when I was starting out on my PhD, I started to do it only to look at innovation, and as you know, I've been active in the FOSS scene. So my first question that came to my mind was actually to look at how to measure FOSS, its impact, especially in India. And one of the things I really didn't find was actually the data.
Yes.
Right? So the challenge that I saw was that there were contributions from India, but they were like Wipro was doing it, TCS would be doing it for their client, their customer. So those contributions would go in as their, so you didn't really find an India contribution. Then there were people like Sutrapa Banerjee was there. I think she was at FOSS 2006 or something. She was one of the keynote speakers. She was a Linux kernel developer at IBM at that time. So there were people who were developing it, but the values that we measure, how do we really measure? GitHub has this project, they said that they will give their data, but GitHub is just a, let's say, tip of the iceberg. So, I mean, the real question is, how do you really measure who is an Indian contributor, how many are contributing, what are they contributing? And that is really a tough nut to crack, if I would say. How are you planning to do that, or have some, and I'm very happy to discuss that offline also with you.
Yeah, so the thing is, in this case, Samagata Foundation is funding the National Law School. And I think in the interest of academic freedom, we cannot dictate the methodology. But I have connected the team to Mirko, who did the Linux Europe study. And so they have shared some ideas on the methodology, etc. I think the methodology should be opened up in a few months now. So, but I would say that, the only guidance we have given is that maybe it's good to have a conservative estimate, a mid-level estimate, and an aggressive estimate. And so we can kind of put out a spectrum of possibilities, and we can then go to. And I think the most important is that the assumptions, etc., have to be well tested, so that when we see, these IAS officers are extremely smart. They cut through bullshit. So, and everybody goes to them and bullshits and says, oh, aisa hoga, waisa hoga. So we have to give them good data, and we have to, give them good conclusions. Absolutely, absolutely. Get. Yeah. Any other questions? If not, oh, somebody at the last.
So you said about that what can't be measured can't be managed. But I'm unsure about that fact. For instance, I've heard of fisheries in West Bengal which were managed by limiting the amount of fishes that one fisherman can catch. They weren't limited, they weren't based on the fact about how many fishes are actually in the river. So, yeah. Uh, yeah, so why, I mean, is there really a relationship between measuring the impact and avoiding the tragedy of the commons?
Yeah, I would say yes, because if you can argue, go to the government and say that this is the value of FOSS for India, and then and say that therefore you have to implement the policy on development of software using open source, etc., more aggressively. I think we have a good case. If without that, I think it's much harder to argue for that. And ultimately, I think every few years, I think we should keep measuring the impact of FOSS, because In 2009, we said that the impact of FOSS is about $1 billion on India. But 2024, 2025, what is the impact of FOSS? I think if we can trace that arc, and we can, again, I go back to what I said earlier. 15 years ago, proprietary software was the norm, and FOSS was the exception. Today, FOSS is the norm, and proprietary is the exception. But that fact is still not sunk into the heads of so many people. I think probably we ourselves don't realize historically that so much has changed. It's only when you make this data explicit that you can kind of say, okay, how does policy making need to change? Should we be investing more in IndiaFOSS and building a community around all the 2,600 software programs that the government of India has uploaded onto IndiaFOSS? So good data is always a good basis for argument and to push policies. Rahul, you have a question? Rahul, as the CEO, has the right to ask the last question. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, otherwise, the replacement from, let's say, iPhone to Android is like a massive price difference. Yeah. Point. Rahul?
So what can we do, or FOSS United as an organization has done to make sure the FOSS laws are implemented properly in the society?
So I'll give you one example. The policy on open source for e-government. It says that all things being equal, if the government is building a project and there are two software, let's say operating systems. If the capability of both these, the proprietary and the open source operating systems are equivalent, they should go with the open source operating system. But it is there on paper. So what we could do is we could start looking at all the tenders that are published and look at how many of these tenders are actually being kind of quoted on FOSS. So there is so much that can be done. There is the open standards policy. So we can look at that and evaluate how much of the open standards policy is being followed. My guess would be that it's not really followed very strongly. If we kind of start searching for the data, we'll find that there is. Just to give another example. I was talking to somebody in the Ministry of IT and asked him exactly the same question, and he said, "See, the problem is that we have vendors who build the software for us, the systems, etc., and they quote on technologies that they are most familiar with. So in many cases, that is sometimes proprietary software. So the systems are built using a mix of open source and proprietary. Can we start increasing the amount of open source that is used in these projects? Can we start pushing for more of that? I think slowly we can make a lot of changes happen. I won't, but again, we have to look at this as a marathon or as a 10-year process and start pushing the government in the right direction.